Hey, welcome back to the channel, Intuitive Hacks. So here today is going to be more of a financial hack. I know sometimes I discuss career hacks, discuss health hacks, mindset hacks. So this is a financial hack. It's crazy. The average person could really be a millionaire pretty easily without having to do too much in their sleep. And here I'm going to walk you through some things that most people don't think about as well. These are some things that I've learned just because, my mother works the financial counseling space. She was a financial counselor for soldiers in the military. And these guys don't make a ton of money, but you'd be surprised how many of them are walking around with $1 million, at least the ones that implement some of this knowledge once you understand it and once you understand the power of it all, especially once you understand the power of compound interest and how your money works over time. Now, I know many of us are hesitant and we don't really understand how much our money could grow over time, just because we don't, uh, a lot of times we don't have the patience. Sometimes we think we have to put in a ton of money to really get rich, when that's not true at all. And here I'm going to show you how even something as little as $50 can make a huge difference and can generate millions of dollars for you. So I'm going to use a couple of different uh, stocks, for example, and I'm going to walk you through the logic, right? So let me go ahead and share my primary screen just so you have an idea what I'm talking about here. So let's look at this. So you should be able to see Apple, right, which is a uh, pretty common company, um, pretty stable stock, has been around forever, constantly produces revenue, and it's made tons of millionaires. And I'll show you how. So I myself, when I'm looking at making investments for rate of return, most of the time we'll overestimate what can happen in 3 to 6 months and underestimate what we can do in 3 to 5 years. So for example, if you look in the past 5 years, Apple has grown by 257%. So I'm not going to walk you through the exact mathematics. It's actually probably closer to 30 or 40% per year annually. But just to keep the math simple, let's say that Apple is growing by 30% per year. And when you compound at 30% per year over 5 years, it should be 150%. But because it compounds from the previous year, let's assume that that's what got you to 257%. More than likely, it's actually less than that. Is well, actually more than that. It's probably closer to 40% per year for the past 5 years for Apple. But if you think about it, that means if I have $100,000 invested in Apple, then in the next um, year, if I do 30 or 40%, I'm making 30 grand per year with that 100,000, right? If I do 40%, that's 40,000 per year. If you extrapolate that to where if I have $1 million invested in Apple, then and it does 30% for the year, then what I end up with is actually uh, $300,000 to $400,000. So you can quickly see how by accumulating $1 million within an investment account that's invested in Apple, anyone that invests $1 million in Apple and it averages 30% per year, they're making 300 grand per year without having to do anything in their sleep. Right now, the challenge is how do we get to that $1 million, which is what I'll walk you through here. Or interestingly enough, if you had $1 million invested uh, within 5 years, you'd have an additional 2.5 million on top of that. So you would end up with about $3.5 million from a $1 million investment in Apple. So that's over the past 5 years. Let's look at the max over the course of history. So it's 154,000%. So that means your money would have multiplied is 100%, right? Is your money. So 1,541 times. So if you would have invested $1,000 with Apple, you would have 1.5 million roughly, right? Just from $1,000. So this is how I'm going to show you that we get to these really ridiculous numbers. Let's look at Microsoft. And these are two common ones. I could show you tons of stocks that have done pretty similar performance, but you look at Microsoft here as well, 257%. And we all use Apple and Microsoft product. All of you guys are watching this video on an Apple or a Mac or a Windows PC or an Android device. So we all use these products and services. So it's no mystery where the money is coming from. As you can see, sometimes it goes down, right, during certain periods. But overall, on average, if you left your money with them in 5 years, you would have had 250. Wow, they're pretty similar, right? 150, 257%. So same thing here. Let's say you're doing on average what 30 to 40%, right, per year. So let me see if you do a max. Same here, 421,000%. So if you had invested $1,000 back in the 1990s, here you would have over $4 million invested in Microsoft. So clearly you can see how, I mean, I'm getting close to my 40s. Had I known this information and I graduated high school about 2003, I could have literally put $1,000 in one of these accounts, graduating out of high school, and right now I'd be a multimillionaire, right? But it's just a matter of giving it enough time to see the results. So here I'm going to show you how you can pretty much set up any of your children to be wealthy within the next 50 years. I mean, not even within the next 50 years. I'm actually going to use a much quicker calculator. But if we just cut things down and just look at 5 years, so 5 years, 257%. If we divide that by a clean five, that's 50% per year, roughly, right? But we know the number compounds, so it's probably less than that annually. So let's say every year you've seen maybe a 40%, or let's go with 30% return on investment. Let me show you this tool right here is the Millionaire Maker. This is what my mom and I use whenever we're strategizing and planning on what we're going to do to generate revenue, how to create wealth for ourselves, and different investment strategies. So I'd said in the title of the video, how do you become a multimillionaire with just $50 a month? Let me show you. So let's say your initial investment is 50 bucks. Your monthly contribution is $50 a month. We're gonna give it the full span of 30 years, right? Which is, if you're 30 years old, you retire by 60, that's 30 years. If you're 20 years old, by the time you're 50 years old, the number will apply. If you have a newborn son, which is what I'm putting into place for my son, right? By the time he's 30 years old, I'll show you what he'll have. Now, estimated rate of return. Uh, so like we saw, we were going off of 50%, right? We said they did about what 50% over the 5 years, but that's not accurate. It compounds on itself. So let's just say 30%, right? And then I'm going to show you a trick to how you double this up because realistically speaking, if you're using a margin account with stocks like Apple or Microsoft, they allow you to double the funds that are in the account. So for example, with my Robinhood account or even with Fidelity, if you decide to use margin, whenever you put $50 into the account, uh, with stocks like Apple, Microsoft, the S&P 500, these major blue chip stocks that have a very strong track record of performing over the past several decades. So it's not like you're hoping and wishing that these stocks will perform. It's something that we know historically that they will perform because these companies have gotten really good at making money and they're getting even better and better at making money to the point where they're valuations far exceed the valuations of most countries on this planet. Apple and Microsoft are worth more than most countries on this planet. So if you wanted to trust these countries and these governments, Apple and Microsoft are probably a much better horse to bet on than most of these countries out here. But so just looking at this, right? So 30% is what you would look at if you don't use any margin. If you do use margin, right? If you use a margin account where it doubles your investment. So if I contribute $50, it doubled to 100, right? If I contribute 100 bucks, they double that. Now I have $200 working for me. Now I do have to pay interest on that money. So let's say your interest rate is maybe 5%. Well, right now I know interest through Robinhood is about 7 or 8%. So let's make it even worse and say your interest rate is 10%. So it's doing 30% return with my initial contribution. With margin, because it doubles the money that I invest with these stocks, that means my money is actually doing 60% every year. But because they're taking 10% annually for interest for me using the margin, or for them loaning me the money to double up my investment, let's say my interest rate is 10%. So then my total will be 50%, right? For my return. So let's say my total return is 50%. And guys, this may seem unrealistic to you. In my individual, in one of my individual accounts right now, I can show you I'm doing about, last year I did about 200%. And that's with margin. I did about 290%. So if you think about it, 50% is actually a very low estimate. That's because I have, a variety of stocks. I have Apple, Microsoft, uh, uh, Nvidia, AMD have done really well for me. But this is just keeping it simple. If you put your money in a conglomerate of stocks like Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, blue chip performers, stocks that have been performing for 10, 15, 20 years plus, that they average out to about a 30 to 40% return every year, sometimes more, by diversifying, right? So let's say my $50 monthly contribution, I could put $10 in Apple, $10 in Microsoft, maybe $10 in the S&P, $10 in Nvidia, $10 in maybe Eli Lilly, $10 in Costco. You can vary it around. All you have to do is come here, look at certain stocks, and what do I mean, right? Let's say Costco stock. There's so many stocks that are performing extremely well. Costco in 5 years did 200%. Max, they did 222,000. So you'd have had 226 times your money, right? So these companies are doing 30, 40, 50% or better. That's just one other example I could use, right? You could use Nvidia. It's down today. This is one day. Don't let this fool you. Max, look at that. 1,000 times your initial investment from 2000. If you were to put $1,000 in at 2000, you'd have over a million, right? Uh, but yeah, so you can do your research, look at stocks that have performed historically, and then you can diversify your funds, because I don't like just putting all my eggs in one basket, right? Any of these companies could disappear. So I always like to diversify with a variety, maybe 5 to 10 different stocks. If you don't even like that, you could do QQQ, which is the NASDAQ, 5 years, 146%, right? So that one went down slightly, but it performs over time. So getting back here, if you're able to net about 50% per year estimated on average with your margin, right, for 30 years, if you calculate this number, look at this. And that's annual compounding. It just compounds once annually. Looking at $239 million. And that's with an initial investment of $50 per month. So if you had put $50 a month in Apple for the last 30 years, you would have $230 million. And this is not magic. This is for real. I myself have built a lot of wealth through stocks. My family has built a lot of wealth through stocks. So I'm not just telling you this. This is not fairy tale, la la land, imaginary money. This is real life money. If you start at 20 years old with $50 a month in Apple or with some of these aggressively growing stocks, this is how much money you will accumulate by the end of it all, within 30 years. And that's with margin, right? So if you're doubling up your investment. If you don't use margin, or let's say you only do 30%, but before we even get there, let's look at this. This is interesting. So in 30 years, you'll be at 239 million. But where will you be before then? So let's say by year 16, by year uh, 16 is when you break the $1 million mark. So you would have $1.2 million by year 17, and you only contributed $10,000. So you only put in $10,000 of your own money, and now it's well over a million in 17 years. And that's the power of compound interest. So you can start an account like this for your child or for yourself. If you're 20 years old, you start putting $50 a month. By the time you're 37, you'll be over $1 million. You can start living off the account because each year this account is making 50% on its own, right? So the next year it'll be 1.8 million. You just grew by 600,000. You can take $300,000 and live off of that comfortably, and your account is still continuing to compound on itself. In fact, when we looked at the numbers, it showed that after the first 100,000, once it gets after that 11-year mark, once he reaches $100,000, your contribution, it doesn't even matter. You don't have to keep contributing after a while. You can just stop contributing to the account, and it'll still do most of the growth on its own because that $50 you're adding every month to $100,000 is literally negligible. It's not relevant. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything because that money is already, you already have 100,000 compounding for your account. You adding an extra $600 throughout the course of a year, it's not going to change the trajectory that dramatically. But you can see, so by year 20, it's over $4 million, right? So by the time your child is 20 years old, he could have $4 million with 50%. Now, this is a relatively aggressive 50% growth, but it's $50 a month. We've blown more than $50 a month on nonsense anyway. You know, I mean, I went back in my reefer smoking days, I'd blow more than $50 a month on that. Hundreds of dollars a month that I would blow that I could have been contributing, right? It's just information knowledge we didn't have at the time. Uh, but let's say let's say you only do 30%. You don't use, maybe you don't use margin. You just go with your own investment. So your investment in Apple or Microsoft or the QQQ or the stocks that you choose perform at about 30% per year annually on average. Uh, or you use margin and your stocks don't perform that well. Look where you end up. Within 30 years, you still end up well over $1 million. So in this at this rate, at about year 24, you'll be over $1 million with only $14,000 of your own money contributed. So this is the power of compounding over time. And this is how you can generate incredible amounts of wealth in your sleep, but you do have to give it that time. And I already know, I already hear it now. A lot of people are going to say, I don't have time, blah, blah, blah. You do, because this time is going to pass you by regardless, right? Uh, this time is going to pass regardless. I remember 20 years ago graduating high school and thinking I didn't have time and I wanted results now and I wanted things right away. But uh, knowing what I know now, you know, there are a lot of things I would have done differently to have put myself in a position. I mean, I'm in a very great financial position now, uh, but I could have been a lot further along had I known some of these principles. So imagine if you put $100 and you put $100 a month at 30%, which is a pretty terrible estimate. But even in this case, you will reach $1 million in 20 years. By year 21, you have over $1 million. So this is how anybody could become a trust. You know, this is how you create generational wealth without using that much money, right? If you have children, if you have grandchildren, you can literally turn them into trust fund babies with with not that much money. Um, so $50 a month, 30 years. By the time they're 20, they will be millionaires. Easy. Uh, and it dramatically increases. I know what my initial plan was once I kind of understood these numbers. I started putting about 500 minimum. I actually invest a lot more than that every month when I work. Just because if you follow a lot of my other videos, I talk about how to get yourself into a six-figure career. Obviously, if I'm making six figures, I'm making well over $9,000. Well, it's over 83, 33 per month to be at 100,000. But I make about well over that amount. So I can invest significantly more than the average person. But the average person can put away $500 a month, right? Let's say maybe not even that steep. Let's say 250. And if you manage to do about 40%, which is very achievable, like I mentioned, I usually now I have my big retirement account, which is in the S&P. That doesn't do about 40% a month, but with my individual stock account through my Robinhood and other assets, I do well over 40% a month. And then I use margin, so I double that up. So that's how I can end up with some years doing 100, 200%, 300%. But let's just go with the low ball of 40%, and you calculate that with $250 a month. How quickly does it take you to become a millionaire? Within 14 years, you become a millionaire, right? At 250 bucks a month. If you do 500 bucks and 500 bucks a month, which we all have that much money. Most of you are wasting that on a car payment or putting that in some mortgage that is not really going to generate that much wealth. If you were to understand the power of the stock market and investing in these companies, if you diversify in the 10 top performing stocks that you can find and you just invest on a regular basis, and then you continue to alternate and invest in new top performing stocks in the industry. So all you have to do is look at stocks that have performed well over the past 10, 20, 30 years, diversify your funds and add new top performers to that list as well, because there are always going to be new companies coming up. You can see in 30 years, you'll be at over 300 million. But how quickly do you get to that first million? You get there within about 12 to 14 years, right? And so you sitting here right now, right? $500 a month, everyone could get to over $1 million in 12 or 13 years. Anyone, anyone could do this in 12 to 13 years. If you're 20 right now, by the time you're 33, you'll be a millionaire. And now that you have this $1 million, your money grows exponentially. So you go from 1.2 to 1.7 the next year, right? From the point where you make when you hit your first 100,000, from that point your life changes because once you have that 100,000, the next year goes to 148. I bet you many of you guys listening right now make less than $48,000 per year. So within 6 years of investing, following this strategy, your account is generating more than you generate at work. Then after that, it just continues to go up from there, from 213 to 305. That's about a 80, $90,000 a year. You can easily take half of that money, live on that, and the account will continue to grow. Now, like we saw in the charts, it doesn't grow every single year. Some years it does pull back, but that's why you want to diversify into different assets, right? But you want to invest in blue chip assets that have a track record of performing over the past 10 or 20 years. Apple, Microsoft, Meta, uh, you know, um, Costco, Eli Lilly, right? Some of the big ones, and then some of the newer ones, Nvidia, AMD. Over the years, they have a track record of performing. Then you can find new stocks that have been performing for the past 5 or 10 years. Add those to the list. I mean, I wouldn't add too many brand new stocks that don't have it. If a stock does not have a track record of 5 to 10 years or better, I generally don't mess with it. I want to see it, because I want to make sure that my account performs. But it's always good to diversify as well because you can have some new breakouts. But by doing this strategy and then using margin, you can easily reach 40, 50, 60 or 70% every year with your account on average, right? It's not going to be every single year, but on average, as long as you see this rate of return, this is what end up happening. Some years you will see 100%. Some years you might see a negative. Some years you might see 20, 30%, 40%. But as long as you continue to diligently invest on a monthly basis with these low dollar amounts that we're talking about, then you can completely change your life within the span of 6 years. You get to over 100,000, which I got there a lot faster than that. Uh, but then from there, within 12 to 13 years, you had $1 million, right? And I know most of you listening to this are not going to put it into practice, but if you could at least just do $50 a month, within 20 years, you'll be over $1 million, right? Now, if you're more aggressive, $500 a month, within 20 years, you'll be well over 10 million, like it shows here, almost at 12 million. But can you imagine, right? 20 years from now, by the time you're 40 years old, sitting on 12 million. And that's what my mother was teaching to a lot of these soldiers on how to generate over $1 million investing in index funds. Index funds would average maybe 12%. But if you were investing pretty aggressively, right? If you're investing $500 a month with a 12% interest rate, you end up with millions of dollars for your retirement. Now, what we realized recently was that you can actually speed that process up using index funds. So some were a lot more aggressive. Once you understand this data, if you put $1,000 a month just in the index fund, right? Some people would max it out, right? But if you can afford to put $1,000 a month in an index fund, by 20 years, you're at $1 million roughly. So if you're 20 years old, by the time you're 40, you're at $1 million. And now this money is working for you, like I mentioned. But doing it with individual stocks, you can see much greater rates of return than an index. So if you're doing it with like Apple or Microsoft, like we just saw, and the equivalent companies that see similar growth, sometimes big greater growth, and then compounding that with margin to see even greater returns, you can end up with over a billion, with almost $1 billion, which is kind of the strategy that I follow these days. Looking here, look at that. So you reach your first million within 12 years, roughly. So it always takes time to ramp up, right? Because the amount of money you're putting in, it needs time to cook and compound. But once you get to that first 100,000, typically within 5 or 6 years, or if you can sprint, get to that 100,000. But once you get there, the money just starts multiplying from 136 to 203. So by year 5, you have 136 grand, and this is your individual trading account. Uh, by year 6, your account made $70,000 that you can pretty much start taking some of that to live on, or if you want to continue to let the account grow. Uh, then the next year, from 203 to 296, how many of you are making $93,000 a year? So in 7 years, in the same amount of time it would have took you to go to college, get a college degree, get a job that pays 90,000 a year, you can literally invest heavily $1,000 a month, whatever income you're making. If you make 40, 50 grand a year, you put $1,000 a month away in your individual trading account, right? Let that money accumulate for 7 years, and now it's making you 90 grand a year. The next year is going to make you over 100 grand a year. And again, this is on average, right? The market's up and down. But some years you see greater return, 200,000. Some years you see 100,000. And before you know it, your account is making you two, three, $400,000 a year without you having to work. And then you can continue to let it compound, because after a while, I mean, you can take some of that money and live off of it, right? That's why within 10 years, you could pretty much retire yourself using these individual stocks. And then from there, you allow the money to multiply. But if you don't touch it and you let it grow, I mean, I guess by the time you get to year 10, you can start living off of the money. You can start taking 40, 50 grand a year. It's not going to impact the growth that dramatically, but the account is still going to continue to compound on itself to where you be sitting on millions upon millions of dollars before you realize, right? And for your children and grandchildren, you know, uh, you created generational wealth as long as you teach them the same principle of not dipping into the account and not taking more than 4%, 5%. If the account is doing 30% per year, you can take 5 to 10% comfortably, and the account will continue to grow. So as long as you don't deplete the account, you're going to continue to generate this wealth. These are not make-believe numbers. These are for real numbers. We know people who've achieved these numbers. My family has achieved these kind of numbers. I've seen significant growth, and I'm well on my way to seeing some numbers like this myself. So this is the strategy I follow. I invest in these blue chip stocks, Microsoft, Apple, stocks that have a track record. I don't even look at what they're doing this 1 day, 5 day, 1 month. Say I don't care. What I want to know is what have you done in the past 5 years or max? Because I'm in this for 5 years or better. 5 years is when you're gonna see the returns that you want. Whatever is doing the next month or 6 months, I could care less. That's not my problem. I want to know what you've done in 5 years, what you've done in 10 years, what you've done in 20 years. And that's how I make my decision. If what I see for the 5 to max is great returns, that's where I'm putting my money. And if I see better than 30 or 40% returns, I'll put my money there and I'll use margin to double the return that I see. So instead of seeing just 30 or 40% return per year, I'm seeing 60 to 80% return per year. Like I mentioned, I've seen up to 300% return per year in my account. So this is a legit solid way where you can become a millionaire within 10 years. And this is a legit solid way where you can create generational wealth for your family with 50 bucks a month, like we started with, right? $50 a month. Just to show you guys again, this is not made up. 30 years, seeing about a 50% return on investment. Calculate 230 million, and you'll be a millionaire here this quickly. By year 6, or yep, by year 11, you can start living off the account, because that 100,000, that $6,000 you invested within 11 years turned into 100,000, and the next year to generate even more growth for you. So hope this was helpful. Guys, have a wonderful day.